so much. I love you so much. I love you so much. I love you so much.
Hello, all you positive heads out there. Thanks for tuning your beautiful brainwaves into another episode of the Positive Head Podcast, where we are firmly convinced that creating success and happiness is rooted in understanding the ultimate nature of reality and the fact that as human beings, we are all immensely powerful fractals of the one and only source consciousness, which creates and animates all things. Now, of course, understanding this powerful truth is one thing. Applying this incredibly empowering wisdom to everyday life? Well, that's another, which is exactly why we provide you with a fresh serving of soul food for thought 5 days a week to help constantly remind you of what matters most. You are it. And I'm your host, Brandon Beecham. I'm the reflection and extension of you who will be here each Wednesday interviewing a different consciousness changemaker. And on the other 4 weekdays, leading the way to ensure that your perspective is consistently expanded, your vibration is constantly elevated, and your heart is overflowing and full. Also, before we jump into today's episode, I'd like to take about a minute and a half to tell you about a few sponsors that not only help to make it possible to produce this show 5 days a week, but that I'm also genuinely passionate about promoting. The first longtime stellar supporter of the show that I want to mention is Gaia. If you're not familiar, Gaia is the go-to source for streaming consciousness content online with over 8,000 video titles. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. The second sponsor I'm sincerely passionate about promoting is Purium. It's no mystery that bringing your mind, body, and spirit into balance is necessary if a person truly intends to manifest the greatest and grandest version of themselves. So if you've been looking for a way to easily get organic superfoods into your system every day with a simple plan that can help you reestablish a healthier foundation and relationship with food, like I was doing before I found Purium, I highly recommend going to positivehead.com/transformation and checking out the videos and interviews there where I dive deeply into discussions explaining why I take these products every day. And should you ultimately end up on iShopPurium.com to purchase any of their 50 plus amazing superfood products, be sure to use the code POSITIVEHEAD, all one word, for a 25% discount. All right, all you positive heads, on this week's Soul Share, I'm very excited to have Dr. Alex Lickerman here with me on the show. Alex is an author of several acclaimed books, The Undefeated Mind and The 10 Worlds, and we're going to explore the wisdom in both on today's episode. Very excited to do so. Alex, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to start off with the standard, typical question I like to open with, and it is this. You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You got 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Oh, that's an awesome way of putting it. My passion is two things. I would say helping people to become healthier and happier. And there's detail there, but in general, if I have 10 floors to explain this, I'd say specifically around developing resilience and about understanding what happiness really is, the different types of happiness, and how one goes about achieving the type of happiness that lasts. And it's not the way we think it is. So those things are very tightly closed, knit together. And that I would say is where my passion lies.
I love that passion. That's so wonderful. And as someone who sort of, I always think back to my uncle when I was a child, he would, or even teenager, maybe early 20s. He started referring to me as the eternal optimist. And I really tie that to the idea of resilience. So, and just sort of, picking myself up. And of course, I'm about to do a show called Optimistic. So I think it's kind of all coming full circle now. I love the idea of resilience and being a key factor, and we'll dive into that here in a minute. But before we do, I would love to to also maybe just get a little bit of your backstory. I always like to know who I'm talking to and how they got to where they're at.
Sure. So my backstory is I'm an internal medicine physician, primary care physician, trained at the University of Chicago, and I actually worked there for 20 years. Taking
my
care
uncle's
of
from
patients.
Chicago, who always said that.
Cool. Yeah. It's a great town, great city. Love it.
It is.
And love the University of Chicago. This was a university really that is most typified by its love of ideas. That's what the university's passion is ideas, and that's me. I never thought I'd leave, but I did. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said cool. Yeah.
Oh, so I basically I was there, as a practicing physician, and for most of my time there, I was a practicing Buddhist, what I consider or would call a secular Buddhist, and I'm happy to sort of talk about what I mean by that.
Sure.
And it was during my time there that I wrote my first book, The Undefeated Mind. Basically, it was triggered by an experience I had in clinic one day where I saw a patient who had a chief complaint of a runny nose. And what was startling about this patient was not the fact that he had a runny nose, a very common complaint, but by how stopped and gummed up his life was by this runny nose. And we spent a long time talking about the incredible impact that it had on his life. And while I was trying not to say to him, dude, it's just a runny nose, because he was really clearly suffering a great deal from this, how much it was making his nose run and how stopped his life was by it. And so I took care of him, and, it was not that hard a symptom to manage. But the next patient I saw was a woman who had been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer who was actively dying. And what was astounding about her was the visit was really more about her telling me and describing to me how she had achieved a level of acceptance and peace with her impending death that I thought to myself I would only hope to be able to achieve myself if and when my death I see coming. And really I was learning more from her in that visit than she was from me. And I left my clinic that morning really startled by the obvious juxtaposition of these two stories. What we'd expect the person we would expect the person with a runny nose to be very casual about it, and the person who's dying of breast cancer to be devastated by it. In fact, it was the exact opposite reaction back to back that I observed. And it made me think a lot about, this notion of resilience and how are we born with a certain amount of resilience and that's all we get? Or are there things that we can do to actually affect our resilience and improve our resilience? And so I began doing a lot of research, studying what was in the literature, and really I should tell you at the form of Buddhism I was practicing had or has as its core tenet the notion that in order to be happy in life, one of the most important requirements is you have to be strong. You have to be resilient. You cannot succeed in life. You cannot be happy in life if you are weak. And
interesting.
I wondered if the 2,500-year-old philosophy that I had been trying to live in practicing Buddhism had as its basis any science behind it, any evidence behind these practices. Because you asked me initially, this question that got me going on this train of thought was, what's my background? And my background really is, I am a scientist. I consider myself to be a physician scientist. And by that I mean, I will believe any wacky thing that you want to tell me, no matter how wacky it is, if there's evidence to suggest that it's true. And I take my responsibility as a physician very seriously. I don't recommend things to people that don't have evidence behind them. And when I do, it's because there is no evidence and I'm using my experience, but I'm very careful to warn people, this is based on my experience, not on any science. Know that.
Sure.
Right? So I say that because, there is this Buddhist philosophy talking about all these different ways people could affect their own resilience. And I wanted to know, was there science behind it? Was there a program that could be created from that evidence that I could recommend to people confidently that would actually help to improve the resilience? Or was resilience something that you're either lucky enough to be born with or unlucky enough to be born without? And, the thesis of the book that I ended up writing was that it's not the former. It's very definitely it's not the latter. It's very definitely the former, meaning there absolutely are very specific things we can all do moment by moment to increase our resilience so we're operating at the top of our range, right? Like any personality trait, there is a genetic component to this. We have a range that we're built in. But how can we each make sure that we're operating at the top of whatever our range is. And so that's what that book was about. And I, at that time, had begun a blog, thinking that if I wanted to write books, which had always been my ambition, that I needed an audience, and that seemed to be at the time a great way to start to develop one. What actually happened was an editor from an imprint of Penguin found my blog and reached out to me and said, "I love the voice and the subject matter of your blog. If you ever want to write a nonfiction book, please reach out to me." So I checked her out on Google, discovered she was legit, and came up with this. This was right around the same time I was thinking about this notion of resilience. And so it was this great coincidence that I was thinking around this at the time she reached out to me. And so I wrote up a book proposal, sent it to her, and she rejected it. So,
oh, wow.
It was really, yeah. She actually really liked it. But, the way publishing works in the nonfiction world is, you have to get, an editorial board made up of a group of acquiring editors will put forth projects to their publisher, but it can't just be one lone voice. They have to get support from their colleagues. She sent my proposal around to her colleagues, and they just didn't feel that it was going to be a viable project. So with great regret, she turned it down. But by then I put so much work into it, I wasn't ready to let it go, and I really believed in it. So I actually reached out and blind queried a bunch of agents, and one agent responded to me within 2 days, said she'd love to see it, and after reading it overnight, loved it, agreed to represent me, and then we polished it and sent it out, and eventually it sold, and then the rest of this, as they say, is history.
Excellent. What a great story. How, one person sort of spawned you on, spurred you on, and then it ultimately led to, coming through a different avenue, which how often in life is that the case? People always try and sort of, I feel like, figure out what is the next move going to be and where is it going to lead. And oftentimes it's like, you need to go through one thing to go through another to take on this job to get to the real job that you really want to do. You know what I mean?
Well, ironically, that actually ends up being one of the chapters in that book, describing how the name of the chapter is Expect Obstacles, how the path to victory or to our goal is almost never what we envisioned from the beginning. And we have to take that into account. Yeah.
Yeah. So very cool. So maybe you can give us, I don't know if you have a preference in which book. I thought the most useful, informative thing we could do today with our time. Of course, there's no way we're going to be able to go as deep into your two books as reading them would be, but just kind of from a high level, giving us some insight into, I don't know if you think one would be more appropriate to sort of dive into first. The Undefeated Mind or the 10 Worlds, but I think that would be wonderful to do with both.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just start with the 10 Worlds with the Undefeated Mind, since I wrote it first, and it sort of, in some sense, is a precursor to the 10 Worlds. So as I said, the basic thesis is resilience can be learned and can be practiced. The issue is sort of like you have to know the right way to go about it. In the same way, if a team practices to play baseball and they become experts at baseball and know all the rules of baseball and then show up to play soccer, they're going to lose because they're playing the wrong game. There are ways that the studies show work and ways that don't work to build resilience. And I don't mean for a second to imply that everything I wrote about in the book and the research I read about and sort of translated into the ideas in the book are the only way to go about developing resilience. But they are really powerful, pragmatic ways. And I should also tell you, after I wrote the book and published it, while I was still at the University of Chicago, around that time I took on a new role there as director of the Student Health Service. And one of the things I had the ambition to do there was to teach students resilience. And we actually created a curriculum, a program that we called the Resilience Project, that was based on the book that I wrote, which was based on the research that I did. We constructed this curriculum and started delivering it to students. And because we were at the University of Chicago, we studied it. And what we discovered was that the students who went through this program, not only did their resilience increase by about 10%, which, while that may seem like a small amount in the world of psychological studies, that's actually a huge impact. It actually turned out to reduce the levels of anxiety and depression to that equal to that of medication. So that was a real interesting, unexpected, and wonderfully surprising finding. And so we have a paper that's pending in the literature to be published to sort of describe that. But the idea being that we validated that these methods really do work. So I would be happy to sort of give you an overview of the principles. There's 9 of them, and we could talk about a few of them.
Yes, love that.
So one of them we alluded to a minute ago, which is expect obstacles. And the notion here is this, that how we cannot control how hard it is to achieve a goal, right? There are going to be obstacles that pop up, some that we anticipate, some that we don't. And the actual activity we have to go through to achieve that goal is often difficult and challenging for us. Otherwise, it would maybe not be a goal worthy of our attention. So we can't control how hard it is to achieve a goal, but we can control how hard we expect it to be. We actually have conscious control over setting our expectations. And expectations, it turns out, is this really interesting lever that we're able to pull to affect how we respond to adversity. So what do I mean by that? So it turns out that if you have, say, a goal, and you have a series of tasks that you have to accomplish in order to achieve that goal, and you look at that first task and you say to yourself, that task looks pretty hard. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that. And you attempt the task and you fail at it. If you compare that scenario to where you look at that first task and say, oh, that looks really pretty easy, I'm sure I'm going to be able to do that, and then you fail at it. If you compare the degree of discouragement and how much that failure will go on to affect your subsequent performance in retrying that task and achieving the other subsequent tasks, it turns out if you expected that first task to be easy and you failed at it, you are far more likely to become discouraged and quit, or if not quit, have your performance on subsequent tasks be degraded than if you expected that task to be difficult and you failed at it. In other words, expecting a task to be difficult or having a realistic expectation of how difficult it will be immunizes you against discouragement. And discouragement, if you have a task that requires long-term planning and work, is one of the most important things to avoid, because no matter how hard a task is, if you are not discouraged, if you continue to believe you can do it and therefore continue to work at it, if you have the right skill and you have the right time, you will eventually succeed. If you become discouraged, the real risk is that you'll quit. So the benefit of learning to expect obstacles in a particular way, of actually tuning your expectations accurately, is that it prevents you from becoming discouraged, which if you really think about it, is one of the greatest benefits you could ever acquire in accomplishing something difficult, is to avoid becoming discouraged, because obstacles always arise when you try to do something worthwhile. And so it's your internal view of those obstacles and how they affect your internal emotional milieu, in a sense, that determines in one way or another how you're going to succeed. So to give you an example, here's an example. When I give a talk about this, I talk about, so my father, when he was alive, one day when we were in high school, my brothers and I came home and said, I'm going to learn to play the saxophone. And we kind of rolled our eyes because my father always had these kind of wild ideas and things he wanted to try, and he never sort of stuck with them.
Sounds like a cool dad, though.
Yeah, he was a great dad.
A dad that just comes home and just says, I'm going to learn the sax, randomly.
We're
my dad never
awesome.
did that.
No. We were like, that's awesome, but we'll see it we'll believe it when we see it.
Yeah.
So he rents his saxophone, comes home and says, all right, he announced, I'm going to practice my saxophone. So he goes in the bedroom, closes the door, and we wait because we thought we were going to hear the sounds of like a pregnant water buffalo coming out of his bedroom. And in fact, what we heard instead was nothing. And we thought, well, that's really curious. What's going on? So the next day he comes in down to the kitchen, says, all right, I'm going to practice my saxophone. Goes into his bedroom door, closes the door. We wait. And again, we hear nothing. Third day he comes out and announces, I'm quitting. And we said, well, what happened? Right? And he said, I knew I wouldn't be able to make this thing sound good right away, of course, but I had no idea that I wouldn't be able to make a sound at all. He, in fact, had been blowing his brains out into the saxophone and could literally not make it a sound. Now, I can't prove this, but I am fairly convinced that if he had only spoken to his teacher or to another student and said, hey, how is this going to go in the first little while I'm learning to play a saxophone? And the student said, oh my God, I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't even literally make a sound for 2 weeks. And my father knew that was how this went, that it was not, unusual. I don't think he would have quit. I think he would have said, oh, okay, I can't make a sound, but no one makes a sound this early. And so this is part of the learning process, because his expectation would have been set correctly. He would not have become discouraged and quit, right? How often do we quit just because something doesn't meet our expectations of the difficulty, and we immediately start telling ourselves a story. It's too hard, I can't do it, when in fact we just had unrealistic expectations. And the way we
Right.
set our expectations is we get a gestalt. We do this unconsciously. Oh, I'm going to train for a marathon. Oh, it's going to be pretty hard, but I think I can do it. And but what we don't do is we actually don't talk to people who've walked the path before us. We'll do that when we want to learn how to do something, right? We're looking for a mentor, but we won't necessarily do that looking for, a view of how difficult it might be. Because if we did that, for example, with in training for marathon, we might learn from most people who've trained that you should expect to have some type of injury, right? And when people get injured, they may think, well, this is over. My training's over. I can't train. I can't do the marathon. And they say, well, no, that's not it at all. In fact, most people get injured. And this is how you deal with it, depending on the injury. And you can still run the marathon, right? If you knew to expect that and then it happened, your reaction to it will be very different than if you didn't expect it, didn't know this could happen. And so simply by arming yourself with a method by which you learn to expect obstacles in a realistic way, in a mindful way, you can dramatically immunize yourself against being discouraged and dramatically increase the likelihood that you will succeed at your goals.
Right. Very, very interesting. Yeah. The perspective perspective in general is the most important thing, in my opinion, that you can really shift to create success in life. It always comes down to, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. A lot of times, the Chinese proverb, fall down, 7 times, get up 8. And so often people, I feel, throw in the towel just before the bloom is going to break through the mud and actually start to appear. And, there's so many great examples of that, of people, I think of like Walt Disney, or people who just got their butt kicked over and over and over again, but just had that sort of like childlike wonder and perseverance, and ultimately, overcome.
Well, I think that's right. And certainly having malaligned expectations of how hard it's going to be will contribute to you giving up, right? And yet at the same time, it's not enough, right? Because if you really fail 7 times, even if you've expected it to be hard, the idea of getting up for that 8th time could be pretty daunting. And so that leads to another principle in the book, which is the chapter is titled Find Your Mission. And the notion here is that, as Nietzsche said, we can handle any how if we have a why. Meaning that, when what you're doing, when the goal you are trying to accomplish is there because you have a larger purpose. In other words, it's a strategy you're using to fulfill some larger purpose that feels like the most important purpose or value creation that you're here to do. Right? You've identified your personal mission. So for me, in the course of writing the book, what I realized is my personal mission, the thing that feels more important for me to do with my life than anything else, is to alleviate suffering where I find it. That mission has sustained me through failure after failure after failure in a way that nothing else can. And I'll tell you another story that gives a great example of this. And so, this combines with, expecting those obstacles to help you keep going. My wife, who's far more hardy than I, one day, a number of years ago, decided she wanted to summit Mount Rainier. I don't know if you know about Mount Rainier, but it's it's supposedly the most difficult technical climb in North America. And it's incredibly challenging. And the way she trained for this summit was she would get on a Stairmaster, and she and I would do interval training where, you'd be 2 minutes at the most intense level you could stand, and then you have to go 2 minutes of rest and 2 up, down, up, down. She would literally, with a 50-pound weight vest on her back, would do the high intensity level that we did during intervals, not for 2 minutes, but for 2 hours. So, I mean, she was getting into a level of condition.
I hope you don't get her too mad. Like,
man,
get your butt kicked.
She is a level of intense that makes me seem like I'm stoned all the time. I mean, she is just, all right. So she had this goal. She likes to challenge herself physically. And she thought Rainier would be like one of the greatest challenges she's ever faced. And so she went on this trip, and she, even just the hike to the base camp almost broke her. And then what they do is they actually sleep in the afternoon, and they have to start summiting at 6 p.m. because they have to get there at midnight, Because if they get there any later, and they're summiting when the sun's coming up on the way down, the snow starts to melt, and the risk is, it'll melt enough that they'll fall into a crevasse or it'd be an avalanche. People have died on this climb. So on her way up, it's pitch black. The moon is out, but you can't see much of anything other than a few feet in front of you. The wind is whipping at 40 miles an hour. And she was like, there were times as she's climbing thinking, this is too hard. I cannot do this. In fact, the statistics are about half of everybody, who, by the way, is trained just as hard as she is, turns back. Half people don't make it, and they choose to turn back. And she was at that point multiple times along the trip. And what kept her going when she was thinking to herself, all right, I'm about to raise my hand and say, I cannot do this. Every single time, what kept her going was not her desire to see if she could do it. What kept her going was the fact that her brother was with her. When she had originally decided to do this, she put out a message in all social media to all her friends, said, does anyone want to do this with me? And her brother said, I'll do it with you. And so he trained and he did all this, and they were doing it together. And she thought to herself, if I turn around, he's going to turn around. And what kept her going, her reason why was not about her, it was about her brother. And that's what sustained her and enabled her. Ultimately, both of them summited the mountain, and they were both crying it was just this incredibly emotional moment. The point I'm making is that, number one, we don't always know what is the why that motivates us. But when we find the why that is the most important reason we do anything, and we get incredibly discouraged as we go back to that, that Chinese proverb, on the seventh try, we're like, I can't get up an eighth try. I expect this to be hard, but this is harder than I imagined. I just can't I'm not going to get up again. If we have the reason why we're doing it firmly fixed in mind, and we can turn back to that, and it truly is the most important reason we could think of, that reason will sustain us. That reason will make us resilient in ways we cannot imagine, enable us to do things we didn't think we could do, right? It's the old saw of like, if you are a parent and you are trying to save literally the life of your child, you will do anything because it's that important to you. And having that reason why fixed firmly in your mind to turn to when you are ready to give up everything, that is the reason that will sustain you and keep you going. And that is another principle you can use to make yourself resilient, meaning, why are you alive? What are you here to do? And that's not what you're going to spend every moment of your life doing. But if you're taking on an important goal, that goal needs to be connected to your personal mission, so that when you get discouraged, when you fail at it 7 times, you get up the 8th time because you remember why you're doing it.
Yeah. That's such an important piece. I mean, even thinking from an entrepreneurial business perspective, what is the aim of the organization, and referring back to that and sort of with everything that you do. And so now, would you suggest that, so when someone is attempting to do anything that is challenging, like Mount Rainier, or maybe not necessarily that challenging, but just in general, if it's a challenging sort of mission that someone is taking on, is that sort of what you recommend? Is them getting very, very clear on what their why is?
No question. Yeah, no question, because you don't know what obstacles you're going to face, and you don't know how hard it's going to be. You try to set your expectations in such a way to immunize yourself against discouragement. But the other reason to do it is to know why, if you should do this in the first place at all. In fact, if you're a busy person and you're a curious, interested person who likes to do different things, the chances are that you're going to have to say no to a lot of things. You're going to actually have to make choices about what you spend your time and energy doing. And so you should be making those choices from the perspective of, okay, this sounds really interesting and cool and pleasurable, and I'm passionate about it. But there's 12 other things I feel the same way about. Which of these things are going to help me fulfill my mission, right? They're not, it's not going to complete it, but it's going to fulfill it. And if the answer is, this really, while it'd be a cool thing to do, has nothing to do with the core reason you're here, and you will have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of resources and energy to do, and you have to make choices, you have to say no to things, what better guide than having clarity about your personal mission? I have turned down really interesting projects because I had so many other projects I wanted to do, and the ones I've turned down did not contribute to my mission of helping to alleviate suffering where I find it in the way the other things I wanted to do did. So not only just, to sustain you when you're on the path to accomplishing that goal, but to help you decide which goals to accomplish in the first place. I think being clear about your mission is a crucial piece of resilience and ultimately being happy.
Yeah. I agree because, the more as someone who gets excited by a lot of things, it's like that's been one of the most challenging things to confront in my own journey is like, oh, there's so many options and things that come at me. And I think when you start realizing, okay, they're not always for you, all the ideas, especially if you have a lot of ideas as a person that they're even generated from you, like I do, it's like, okay, realizing, okay, just because I have this great idea or whatever, it doesn't mean it's my idea or ultimately for me to do. And I think always checking in, it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of advice. Like, is this, I can do anything, but I can't do everything.
That's right.
And what is in alignment with my highest calling and highest excitement?
That's
right. And that really helps us to sift these things.
It does. And so in the book, I talk about how does one go about discovering what your mission is. It's not something you choose. It's something that is sort of, it's already there. It's a matter of uncovering it. And by that, I don't mean it's given to you by some outside power, but what it really comes down to is the type of value that you feel is the most important value you can create. That's not something you get to decide. It's something you already feel about. And so there's an exercise in the book I talk about how does one figure out what you already feel is the most important thing you could do with your life, the most important contributive thing. And when you really have clarity about that, when you can articulate that in a simple sentence, the way I talked about mine, that becomes the measuring stick against which when you don't have the time to pursue every great creative idea you have, you can sort of prioritize them, order them, and figure out which are the ones that are not just going to be the most pleasurable, but be the most satisfying and the most important for you to do.
Yeah. What is can you share a little insight into what your exercise is to help people to sort of sift and figure that out?
Yeah, I can describe it. So the idea is the doorway in to feel what is most important is through the doorway of what is the most enjoyable. So the exercise that I have people do is you pull out a piece of paper, and I think it's really important, by the way, you write this down. Something very interesting happens when you write stuff down. It doesn't happen when you just think about it. So I stress that.
Right.
And what you do is you take out a piece of paper and you write down 25 one-time activities that you have partaken in the past that have brought you the greatest joy. Whether gardening, giving advice and support to a friend, writing a story, composing music, listening to music, watching a movie, whatever. Isolated one-time special things you've done. And then you make another list just as long of things that you do that are ongoing, right? So in general, the idea is you want to cover everything that you do and have done in your life that has given you the greatest joy. Then what you do is you take a look back at those things and you look at the things that have not only given you joy, but have brought value to other people. So, for example, watching movies, you may love to do that. That gives you a lot of joy, but that doesn't create a lot of value for other people. As opposed to, supporting a friend, or maybe you're a teacher in teaching, or gardening or painting may bring, beauty into the world. So that gives value to other people in some way. You basically start to separate out those that are purely for you and those that also bring value to others. And then you circle the ones that bring value to others, and you start to look for patterns. You look for what type of value do these activities have they given and do they give to others, right? How do they improve their lives in some way? And then you start, you take another piece of paper and you start writing down the themes, right? The types of value that you have spent your life creating for others. And then what you do is you sit with it, because what you're looking for is you ask yourself, what feels like of these themes, of these ways of creating value, what feels to you like the most important value you could create? The value that you would want chiseled on your tombstone, or the value that you would want to be recognized at the end of your life by the President of the United States in front of the entire nation, what your life was about. What did you think of it in those terms to help you figure out which of these things you have written down seems to be the most important thing you could possibly do, because that is your mission. And the trick here is to articulate this at a level that is not too broad, but not too specific, right? I did not say that my mission is to be a doctor and heal the sick. That's a strategy, right? That's something that can be taken from me. I can be prevented from being a doctor. But I can't really be prevented from alleviating suffering where I find it, because there's more than one way to do that. Now, there may be the strategies that I use to fulfill that mission are different, and I may enjoy some of those more than others. I may enjoy being a doctor more than, say, being a therapist or being a teacher, which in some sense, also you could argue are there to help relieve suffering where they find it. Maybe not a teacher. That's a bad example. So I may have personal preferences, and I'm perfectly free to pursue the preference I enjoy the most. But any one preference, any one avenue, any one strategy can be taken from us. And so a mission has to be broader, something that can endure, so that if we are blocked from pursuing it in one way, we can pursue it another. So, for example, one of my patients, we went through this exercise, and he articulated that his mission is to fill the world with beauty. He happens to be an artist, right? But it was important that he articulated at that level because, of course, he could lose his ability to be an artist. He could go blind. He could become paralyzed and not be able to fill the world with beauty in the particular way he's currently doing it. But he could still learn how to fill the world with beauty. Now, that wouldn't mean that if he lost the ability to be an artist, he would not grieve over that loss. He would not mourn it and be horribly sad and depressed. But with a mission still there to sustain him, when he would recover from that loss, as he invariably, hopefully would, he would then have a mission waiting for him to help define the next thing he was going to do. And so that's the exercise I put people through.
I like that. That's super powerful. That's such a wonderful share. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Well, now seems like a good moment to take a quick minute to tell those of you who aren't familiar a bit about our sponsor, Gaia. I've been a big fan of Gaia for many years now, which is why they're the only content provider I've ever reached out to in regards to potentially supporting this podcast. So needless to say, I'm very excited they're now supporting the show. Gaia truly is my personal go-to source for streaming consciousness content on the web. They have an incredible 7,000 plus exclusive videos covering 5,000 years of wisdom. Just to give you an example, on the show Missing Links, the incredible researcher Greg Braden explores all the biggest questions concerning who we are, where we come from, where we're going, by connecting the missing links between science and spirituality to complete our understanding of humanity's history and to better understand the interconnectedness of all things. Awesome, right? And that's just one example. As you guys constantly hear me say, it's a daily conscious effort to maintain an elevated vibration. And if you're looking to go deep down the rabbit hole to do so, then Gaia is the best place I know of to do it, period. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. Check it out. So, yeah, and it also gets me thinking, you're talking about tying it to service to others in some way, and makes me think of the Gandhi quote, if you want to lose yourself in the service of others. I add to that with my own sort of spiritual philosophical perspective. The reason that underlying concept works is because there are no others. So once you start playing with the idea of like, okay, the consciousness that animates my form is the consciousness that animates your form, and therefore I'm going to get what I want by giving it away in some way, shape, or form. And that's why I personally believe that service is so important, because you're literally serving an extension of self in some way.
Well, that's interesting. That actually touches on two of the chapters in the second book I wrote, The 10 Worlds, about sort of how does one become happy. So I don't know if you want to segue into that.
Yeah, let's segue into that. That's perfect time.
Okay. Well, so in order to make that segue make sense, I have to sort of talk about what the book is about at a basic level to begin with.
Sure.
So the notion is that the ways in which people pursue happiness throughout time, all of human history, and throughout the world really are mostly wrong. And we argue the following. If you were to imagine everything that every person on the planet currently believes they need to be happy, you would have as many goals and as things mentioned as there are people, right? But if you sifted through all those beliefs and you categorize them into their most basic components, they would all sift down into what my co-author and I argue are 10 basic core beliefs about what happiness, not just what we need to be happy, but about what happiness is. And we argue that 9 of those are delusions, meaning that they will not produce the type of happiness we all want. The type of happiness we all want is a happiness that cannot be taken from us. A happiness that is indestructible, that no matter what trauma and tragedy befalls us, we can continue to be happy. Now, some people may say, well, that type of happiness doesn't exist. But in fact, as we described in the last chapter, there's ample evidence that it does. It's just rare.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about all those different beliefs, 9 of which we argue are delusions. We call them the core delusions. Each of these beliefs produces an inner life state, a mindset, if you will, what in Buddhist terms has been called life condition. And basically it is built out of and constructed out of the beliefs you have about what you need to be happy. And it is what determines everything you think, everything you feel, and everything you do. Your attitude, your energy level, all the things that exist in one moment in your life condition, we argue, are determined by your beliefs about what you need to be happy. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. One of the core delusions is the core delusion of the world that it creates is the world of hunger. And the core delusion is that in order to be happy, you have to get what you want. Meaning we have attachments, right? And there's something that we want, whether it is a certain job, a certain spouse, a certain house, a certain amount of money. And we think if we can't get that thing, we cannot be happy. And we pursue it with an obsessive desire, an obsessive nature. And we really feel this, right? And you could easily imagine, once you lock onto something that you want, whether it's a minor small thing or a major thing, it really does seem as if the entirety of your happiness is contained in you getting that thing.
Right.
And the thing is, of course, that when you get that thing, when your desire is fulfilled, there is incredible happiness. There's incredible joy. And so that seems to support the idea that this belief is not a delusion, that it really does make you happy, because in fact it does. The problem is it only makes you happy temporarily. And we've all had this experience as well, right? We just keep falling into the same trap over and over, that we get this thing we want, and then it becomes just this thing we have, and then it becomes just part of our lives that we take for granted and really don't think about until maybe we're threatened with its loss, at which point we can be devastated by its loss, even though after a while, it really doesn't contribute that much to our being happy. Yeah, absolutely. And
the new car smell wears off.
That's it. And, it's sort of like everything is like chewing a fresh piece of gum that has this great sweet flavor at first, but as we continue to chew it, invariably it fades. And this is just the way we are built. This is our psychology. And there have been paper after paper after paper that talks about this thing called the hedonic treadmill that we're running on. And that you acquire what you want, you have a bump in your level of happiness, and then invariably falls back down to its baseline, and then you're looking for the next thing. And then we get obsessed with the next thing. We think, well, this is the thing that our happiness is contained in, that we have to have in order to be happy. And if we can't get it, we're miserable, even though before we thought of it, we were perfectly happy, right? And we go from thing to thing to thing, thinking this is what happiness is. This is how we achieve it, by continuing going after new things, getting them, enjoying them while we can, and then moving on to the next thing, because we're right back to our level of happiness as we had before. And the problem with this is when you become truly convinced that what you want is what you need to be happy, you literally leap from thing to thing and are constantly in a state of dissatisfaction, constantly aching for the next thing, because even when you get it, it never quite equals the level of joy. It never brings you the level of joy you quite expected. And so your expectation again is misset. And you move on. Well, that wasn't it. And you keep thinking, well, I just haven't found the one right thing that's going to make me permanently happy. Even if you don't frame it in that way, that's really what we want.
Right.
So but as you can imagine, getting up every morning, every day with the intrinsic belief, whether you consciously recognize it or not, that you need to get whatever it is you happen to want, whatever happens to fall into your crosshairs that day or that week, that you want, that you have to get it to be happy. That determines, again, everything you think, everything you feel, everything you do. And it creates this life condition or world of hunger. And in the book, we describe what it's like to live in that world, all the characteristics of that world. And so if you happen to be a person who is mostly governed by that particular belief, you will find that our description pretty much describes your life. And what's interesting is that we call this the 10 worlds because each world is sort of in succession as you go up the ladder. The degree of joy you're able to experience does expand, right? There's not much joy at all in the world of hunger because you're mostly spending most of your time in a state of aching, of wanting, of desiring, which is actually painful. To see something you don't have and desire it is to some degree to experience pain. The only world that lies below it is the world of hell, which essentially is the world of suffering, which is a different thing from pain. It's worse. But as you then go on up the worlds, the beliefs that create these worlds are quite different. But but when each of these beliefs has you in its grip, that is the world in which you will be inhabiting, the internal world that you will be inhabiting.
Interesting.
How does this now connect to what you said about sort of serving others? Well, the ninth world, which is the penultimate world, just under the 10th world, which is the world of enlightenment. The ninth world is the world of compassion. And it is created by the belief that in order for you to be happy, you have to help others to be happy. That there is that one of the greatest joys that come from attachment, because the joy of others being, it is truly, it is created by having something. And in the world of compassion, what you have is the knowledge that you have made another person happy. It is still the happiness that's derived from attachment, because if you fail to make someone else happy, you will not derive happiness yourself. So it still depends on something outside of yourself. But it is, and therefore we call this type of happiness relative happiness. But it is, we argue, the greatest sense of happiness you can have, of relative happiness you can have, is happiness that comes from contributing to the happiness of others, contributing to the value of helping others in some way. So the mission statement ties into this, that if you've identified a mission, by definition, it is a purpose tied to creating value of some kind to others, value that you feel is important. That when you are pursuing that mission and you are providing value to others, you are in that world of compassion, in the life state, in the world in which you're living, the world of compassion. It is the greatest joy you can know, that is relative joy. And so it is not a bad way to live your life, to be devoting yourself to helping other people. And I'm not talking here about sort of the spiritual notions of us all being the same. It's really based on psychology and even neurology, that this is just how we seem to be built.
Right. And actually what happens in the brain, for example, when if I commit some act of kindness, it basically is releasing all the happy chemicals in my brain, the person who's the recipient of the act of kindness, and someone who witnesses the act of kindness, right? So
in fact, we write about this science in the book, which is that we think we have uncovered the part of the brain that generates the feeling of joy when we contemplate having an attachment, and that there are different types of attachment we can have. And we argue that the most meaningful and therefore most joy-producing type of attachment is meaning itself. When we create meaning, the type of joy fulfillment that gives us is arguably greater than the joy we get, say, from watching a movie or getting a massage or getting that car we wanted. And
that makes a lot of sense to me as someone who creates a lot of meaning.
Right. Now, not everybody feels that way. Some people are not in the grip of that belief that the greatest type of happiness you can create comes from the creation of meaning.
That really resonates with me.
Right. But just about, to be human is in some sense to value meaning, but some people value it less than others. But the people who value it greatly, like me as well, it's because we cannot shake our belief that the greatest happiness we can find comes from creating value of some kind. But I argue in the book, The 10 Worlds, that, that is still relative happiness, and it is not the greatest type of happiness that is available to human beings. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't pursue it, but it also means that
transcend it, essentially.
There is a different type of happiness available to us that we call absolute happiness. And that's what the 10th chapter of Enlightenment is about.
Cool. I'd love to hear your breakdown on all that.
So, Enlightenment is not just this mystical kind of otherworldly fantasy fairy tale that most of us in the West think it is when we hear that term, reserved only for Buddhist monks meditating in caves. In fact, in every culture across every time period in human history, there have been people who have described this state. They use different terminology, and they explain it, kind of in the context of their coexisting or pre-existing beliefs, usually some type of religious belief. But when you break down the actual state that they describe, it is remarkably consistent, which the conclusion that I draw from that is that this is a state of the brain that is sort of in the same way that all human beings have the capacity to become angry. All human beings have the capacity to experience the joy of enlightenment. And, that term enlightenment is sort of loaded with a lot of mysticism, and I don't mean it that way. I'm talking about this as a purely neurologically created psychological state, a state of joy.
Gotcha.
And we really talk a lot about the science behind this in that chapter. It's actually fascinating. And we're just at the beginning of figuring this out, but there is really clearly real science that points the way to how the state gets created. And I'll, the chapter sort of tells the story of, what is it how does one create that state in one's own life and one's own mind? And where we end up with is, I'll give you the punchline. The difference between absolute happiness, meaning the state of enlightenment, the joy from enlightenment, that is not dependent on any attachment whatsoever, is that it doesn't come from having something. It comes from perceiving the world in a particular way, learning to perceive it in a particular way. And so that is how, you can lose every attachment that is precious to you. You can lose your house, your job, your health, even your children, and still be able to be happy in a particular way, which isn't to say you aren't also in great pain from having lost those things. Being indestructibly happy does not mean you're not feeling pain. It means you're not suffering, and it still means you can experience joy. And that seems like a contradiction, and I don't mean this in a mystical way, but there's a very particular psychological path to that. And that is, we argue, when you learn to perceive the world around you as sublime. And by sublime, I mean larger than, more perfectly organized than, and more beautiful than you can really even contain within your own mind. And the reason for this, the reason why learning to perceive the world around you, even the common everyday things, as sublime, seems to induce this state of enlightenment is because it makes your sense of self feel small. And this it gets really interesting, where it seems to be by diminishing your sense of self. And I don't mean like, your ego, but I mean literally the feeling you have of being a self. By diminishing that, it paradoxically opens up the sense that you are larger than yourself and connects you to the universe. And you get this very characteristic sense that people, as I said, throughout history have described, that they are connected to a larger sense of the universe, that everything is one, this sense of interconnectedness. Now, I want to be really careful to say, just because it feels that way in this state does not mean that is the way the world is. It doesn't mean we are all one. It means we feel that in a profound way. And that may be a subtle distinction, but it's really important. And the idea is this, that part of being in this life state is to feel the most unbelievable, overwhelming sense of compassion and love for not just people around you, but everything around you. And it brings with it the greatest sense of joy, what we call a transcendent joy, that cannot be taken away from you no matter what attachment you may lose, because it is not coming from attachment. It's coming from perception. And it is a perception that has been described by people who've used psychedelic drugs, because it turns out when we do MRI studies of people with psychedelic drugs, that these drugs will downregulate the part of the brain we now believe is associated with and from which comes the sense of self. And when that happens, crosstalk at lower parts of the brain begin happening that doesn't happen any other way, that seem to generate the sense of joy and other feelings that are described in this awakening experience, this enlightenment experience, meaning that we are beginning to realize that there are actual neurologic events in the brain that occur when people are in this state of enlightenment that are reproducible and explain what the subjective experience, why it's that way. And so what we argue in the book is you can pursue this without psychedelic drugs, even without meditation. There may be other ways to pursue this, but that's one of the ways that has been, a lot of different things that we talk about in the book, where you can practice putting yourself into this life state by learning to see the world as sublime, the same way an actor can practice summoning up certain emotions on demand. It's the kind of thing you can actually get better at, and establish the life state of enlightenment as your foundational life state, no matter what else may be going on in your life. And so, that's what we argue really should be the ultimate goal we all have.
Yeah. Well, as someone who loves to attach meaning, and, I look at something like that and certainly always talk on the show about perspective being everything. And I like to put it as, the goal isn't to always be happy. The goal is to be at peace with what is, right? And to sort of come into this realization that personally believing it is much bigger than myself and simultaneously all me, both sort of this paradox. And once you start applying these perspectives, the results, really, as you're talking about here, is kind of speak for themselves. So my question to you would be, as, sort of a very scientific standpoint on all this, this idea of oneness bringing this effect. Yeah. Do you feel that this is sort of a delusion that is happening, and so it's like sort of based in a lie, or do you believe it is indeed all connected and all one?
Yeah, no, I don't believe it's a delusion. We call this actually the core truth. And while I do, even from an intellectual perspective, it's not at all hard to see how everything's connected. It's easy. Our understanding of physics, our understanding of cause and effect, our understanding of the way the world works, the interrelatedness is truly sublime, in that we're all far more connected than we think about during daily life. And so, but that connection doesn't necessarily mean that everything is the same thing, that I am you, or that, I am the universe. I am a part of the universe. I am a piece of it. I'm a manifestation of it. And the same way, that a drop of water is not the ocean, but everything in the ocean is all contained in every drop of water in it. Everything in the universe, in a sense, is contained within me as well, and you, right? But what I'm talking about is our emotional sense of that, our feeling of that, our connection to that, our subjective awareness of that. That is what the life condition of enlightenment is about. It's about bringing that forth, right? I can describe to you what it's like to be angry, and I can point and say that person looks angry, and I can describe what I might say and how I might behave if I'm angry, all without being angry, right? It's that difference. So I can describe to you what it's like to understand that the world is profoundly interconnected in one sense, one that's very different from feeling it. And the description of it, while interesting, is worthless without the ability to experience what that feels like. But you can't allow, this is where I think, mystics throughout history have made a mistake, and even the Buddha himself, the historical Buddha, made a mistake, thinking that subjective feeling told him about objective truths about the universe. And the truth is, science is actually showing the universe to be far stranger than we ever could imagine it is. And our feeling of oneness with the universe and that connectedness, you have to be really careful about the cosmology, or that seems to bring forth. And so I think a lot of the things the Buddha taught, to be really frank, were kind of nonsense. Like the notion that life is eternal. There's no evidence whatsoever that's the case. There's a lot of reason to think that it's not that way. Oh yeah. No, I don't. I don't.
Have you checked out have you read the book, The Afterlife Experiments?
I have not.
Oh, yeah. I would recommend checking that out, where they did double-blind, triple-blind scientific studies of mediums and people who claim to connect with people in the afterlife. And the scientific conclusion, it was like 1 in, billions that they were guessing and getting the information correct that they were getting. Gotcha.
Well, I'll have to read the book. I'm highly skeptical, because whenever I've seen that done at UCI,
right? It was done at UCI, right down University of California, Irvine. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I'll have to look at it then, but I'm highly skeptical. But there's other things as well that are discussed. This notion of karma, the eternity of life, are really pretty difficult. There's no. My point being that you cannot really derive scientific truths from subjective feelings. You have to prove it in a way. And the Buddha would argue this, and people who are enlightened would say, no, that this feeling that I have of the oneness of life is so overpowering, I can't imagine it's untrue. There's this feeling of, this is part of the experience of becoming enlightened, that you have the sense that you are glimpsing an underlying truth, but there's actually reasons to believe that there are parts of the brain that are stimulated in such a way to make us feel that way. And no matter how strongly subjectively we may feel, we are looking at the ultimate truth. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are. And you're talking to someone here who's had these experiences, who've actually felt that ineffable feeling like I am glimpsing the truth, but I also understand with the other part of my reasoning mind, maybe not. Which isn't to say that subjective experience is not supremely valuable in helping me to be indestructibly happy. But I guess what I'm cautioning is, we can have that amazing experience, but we need to be cautious about what our subjective life state means in terms of the way the world really is.
I agree 100%, especially, because you made a pretty definitive statement there, like it doesn't exist. But to me, honestly, that is like someone who's never been to Fiji, saying, and talking to someone who lives there, telling them like that doesn't exist. And here, Fiji doesn't exist. And meanwhile, you're like, oh, actually, no, I live there. Here's what the streets look like. And no, that's not a real place. I mean, the amount of evidence, what I sense here is, as someone who's obviously highly intelligent and very scientifically slanted, it's like the amount of evidence for some of this stuff is so absolutely overwhelming. I would encourage taking a look at some of the past life recounts that tie into this life in ways that absolutely prove it. Or, if you had 18 hours, I could probably tell you just story after story after story. And of course, you could say, okay, maybe my friend Colby, for example, whose father appeared to her standing at the edge of her bed and said, go search this person's name on the internet. It's your brother you never met. And by the way, she'd never met her father in real life either. And she goes and searches it, finds it, connects with the guy, does a DNA test. It's her brother. I mean, there are unlimited amounts of these kinds of stories if you're willing to actually open up and sort of examine them?
Yeah, as I said at the beginning of our talk, I'm willing to believe any wacky idea if there's credible evidence. And so I'm always willing to examine the evidence. And I have looked at a lot of the evidence for past lives, and I found none of it credible, as compelling as it may be. But I'm always willing to look at more because I certainly don't have all the answers. And I think the universe is a far stranger place than any of us has any conception. And so if there's credible evidence that is... and by credible, because I'm trained in the scientific method, what I might consider credible, others may not.
It's different than someone else.
Yeah,
that's why I recommended afterlife experiments and you may read it and say, oh, the techniques he used are, biased or whatever. But it's very, like I said, it was conducted at the University of California, Irvine, and it's a very thorough examination. But I think people and of course take this I mean this and with all due respect, I think people get the same way I'm predispositioned to believe that it's the case, having had some really, really profound spiritual firsthand experiences. I think it can someone like yourself can be the opposite side of the foot. And I think we both have to be careful not to have have this predetermined. It's like my friend who claims he is not a Trump supporter, to use an example, but yet his perspective is always going to lean towards supporting that person versus the opposite. And I think we all tend to do that. We kind of fall into, oh, I believe this is how it is, so I'm going to always lean that way. You've sort of determined what you think, and you've leaned towards a certain perspective. And I think you said a very wise thing there. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know, and we have to all be very careful with that.
I think your point is extremely important, and you're absolutely right to identify me as predominantly the bias I bring is skepticism towards things that don't have mechanisms that clearly explain them. Which is, but your point also is why I'm so skeptical, which is that I'm acutely aware of the biases we all bring to belief. And so, for example, there is a really well-established scientific explanation for people who have out-of-body experiences or utterly convinced they leave their body. In fact, the brain creates a map of one's body that can, by stimulating a certain part of the brain, studies have shown this. People will report they're feeling that they are leaving their body while awake when this part of the brain is stimulated. So how we interpret our experiences is also dramatically influenced by our biases. And it's very difficult to design experiments that account for those. So, but I take your point extremely well, which is that a predisposition to disbelieve can be as risky for interpreting evidence correctly as a predisposition to believe. And so one has to be mindful of one's biases to the degree that one can. But I'm also very aware of most of the things that people believe, literally just on a daily basis, turn out to be wrong anyway because they're not critically evaluating the evidence. So, having said that, I'm actually very interested and intrigued to read the book you suggest, and I'll look at the evidence.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it afterwards, coming from, sort of the bias and perspective that you do. It's been years and years since I've read it. But, the one thing I would say about out-of-body experiences are, and of course you would probably say there isn't evidence, but, obviously someone can make something up. So that makes it difficult. But if you have lots of people making up that I saw what the doctor was doing to me while I was completely out, and this was actually on top of the cabinet and I can see it, and I reported it back, even though from down here on the ground I would have never known was up there. There's countless stories like this. Yeah,
there are stories, but actually that study has been done, and actually I've read that study, and it turns out they could not accurately report what was in the room. And there's reasons to. Go ahead.
I would just say that's sort of like looking at like my friend Colby, who I've seen predict some incredible things, intuitively. That's like saying, okay, tell me what number I'm thinking right now. Oh, you don't know? Okay, then it's all discounted and it doesn't work. You never got that hit before. It's like these are very nuanced energies that people are interpreting through their brain, even where it is subject to being disrupted or bias or not coming through cleanly. So that's what I think makes it challenging about a lot of those things, is to say, perform right now. Okay, hit every basket, or you're not a basketball player that can hit a shot.
Well, but it's really not the same thing, because if you're arguing that during an experiment someone is having an out-of-body experience, they're reporting feeling themselves floating above the room, why wouldn't they be able to identify things on top of cabinets? They should, if that's really happening, right? If they're perceiving that room as they're describing, then they should be able to perceive.
What if we live in a multidimensional universe and they're seeing an alternate timeline where things are slightly different, or you're talking about things that are so like you said, stranger than we can ever realize. So I think when you really put it in a box and say it's got to be this cut and dry, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I actually have a great I think this is a great point to like segue into what we so. You guys, whenever we schedule interviews, I always will ask, hey, by the way, I love a story of synchronicity or serendipity or positive paranormal story. And Alex, your response was a great one. I was excited by it because I knew we could have this conversation in a respectable, healthy, fun way. But your response was like, well, I don't really have one because I don't really believe in that. And I was like, excellent. I would love to talk about that, and we sort of are already. But just to share, I'll just share, as someone who has all day, every day, just an incredible amount of them in ways that are just mind-boggling sometimes, and sometimes less, sometimes more subtle, but just to share a couple with you that have happened to me, since you don't really have one, I would say it's because you've decided that they're not real. You're creating your reality, and therefore you can't perceive them, right? You're creating your own reality based off your beliefs, as am I, and which is why I see them all day, every day. But well, not all day, every day, but a lot. And so, here's a great example. So I'm sitting at dinner just in the last 3 days, sitting at dinner on Sunday night with my family. My dad is very conservative Christian. He has been door knocking, inviting people to his church for years. I mean, we are in very different ends of the spectrum with our perspectives and beliefs on, spirituality and the ultimate nature of reality. But I respect his his commitment. And, he's 72 years old and he's out there door knocking for the last 20 years, inviting people to this very conservative Christian church. He lives in California now. Originally, we're from the East Coast, where this perspective is probably a little bit more predominant. So he's fighting the good fight, right? And he's out there door knocking, and all of a sudden he meets someone in the last few weeks who is tied to people back east who actually fund the work that he's doing. And he's been looking, he's retired. He's would like to do something part-time that's in alignment with his, highest excitement. He didn't even know this thing existed. Now, all of a sudden, it looks like he might be getting paid to do what he wants to do most, right? And so we're excited for him, even though, like I said, I don't really agree with what he's doing, or his perspective, rather. I know it makes him really, really happy, and, happy for him. So having dinner with my brother and my mom and him, and like, wow, this is really great. Someone actually paying you to do what you've been doing for free for 20 years, and, in your highest excitement. And then we turn to my mother, who is retired, somewhat bored. We've been having the conversation for the last year plus. Mom, we've got to get you doing something that is now dad's kind of got something that really lights you up, right? That makes you, sort of with your aim, your mission. You need to get on that, right? And for her brother was, special needs, severely, handicapped mentally, like sort of basically like a 2-year-old, passed away when she was like 21. Before I was born, but they were fraternal twins, and then her sister, the same thing. So 2 out of 4 children were handicapped, and this is, and then my nephew has Asperger's syndrome. So this has been sort of a theme in my family, and for my mom is a big thing. Like she's been saying forever, I really want to find a way to contribute and help, special needs individuals. And so we got talking about dad's got this thing. We need to find your thing. This is really your highest excitement, helping special needs people. And then, interestingly enough, a woman wanders over to our table, and in the middle of a restaurant, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, where a special needs person comes up and introduces themselves and starts talking about the foundation here in Southern Orange County, where my mom lives, that helps her to do what she does. And this woman proceeds to tell us the details about what she does with her day and her life, and just very unconventional to how someone normally would be, just walking up and, hey, my name's so and here's who I am, and here's what I do. And obviously, you can see that there's something special needs going on, something mentally disabled to some degree. And then she goes on. Where it got really interesting is, of course, we're just having this whole conversation about finding this path, and she names the organization locally that helps her. Then she goes on to talk about her twin. Now, my mother's twin was mentally handicapped. Then she goes on to talk about her dog, Jojo. Now, my mom's brother's name was Joey, and they called him Jojo. So, interestingly enough, I don't know, for me, seeing the patterns, and when these kinds of things happen all day, every day, or a lot to me, it's like, here's your message. Here's a wink from the universe, whatever you want to call it, a synchronicity, your brother communicating, any of these things. That's one story. The day before that, she's visiting her brother from Chicago that I mentioned earlier. They're talking. They haven't seen each other in a long time. The brother just moved out to Southern California. Still has a place in Chicago. He spends half the year. I talked about him earlier, and he happens to be out here. She goes to see his new house in Southern California. Haven't connected much in recent years. Get talking about all the old times in Virginia and college, and he went to college there, and 50 years ago or whatever. They go to walk back to the train, and all of a sudden the train pulls up with ODU on the side of it, Old Dominion University, this small school in Southern Virginia that he happened to go to, that he had just been talking about moments earlier. For some reason, written on the side of a train in Southern California. Okay, coincidence? I don't know. But when these kind of things happen over and over and over, and you start to see the patterns, to me, it becomes you just are wanting not to see. And that's a mild example. Sometimes it's like so incredibly magical. It's like you wouldn't believe half of the stuff that I told you. Those are like some really like low level basic examples. So I'd be curious what you think about those things.
Yeah, I wonder, how does one distinguish between those things happening as coincidence and those things happening as intended by a higher power? How does one tell?
A coincidence, or a synchronicity being like a meaningful coincidence. So let's tie in the higher power piece to it. That's a great question. So now let's say all of a sudden an angelic entity appears at the end of my bed and has profound communication with me that greatly alters my life and expresses the idea that, like the countless number of near-death experiences, for example, where people go experience on the other side and come back with the same message over and over and over and over and over again, which is, you're one with the source that creates and animates all things, and you are God, and it is you, and there's no separation between you. The only separation is an illusion. So you start having these experiences that go well beyond where these people will claim feel realer than this experience, right? I mean, would it be any stranger that any of that goes on than the fact that you and I are here and having this conversation right now? I don't personally think so. We've gotten accustomed to it and decided this is normal and okay. So then when we kind of put that into a box and say, oh, it's all, sort of scientific and, it's just, I don't know, cogs turning in a wheel. Somehow the universe came together as a perfectly working watch because it stewed long enough. To me, that just doesn't make sense. And I'm not trying to be argumentative or anything. I'm really just trying to share with you my perspective. And once again, once you've been to Fiji, you then start to say, okay, it's obvious that it's not just some random event. I mean, what are the statistical scientific odds of us having that conversation and then this person coming up with the name JoJo and telling me the place where she should work, basically, and that she's a twin too, and all about her twin. So what are the statistical possibilities or potentials there?
That is exactly the right question to ask. And so when you have these episodes of synchronicity that seem to stand out so starkly, the odds seem so astronomical. You say this was in some way intended. In other words, by synchronicity, I assume you mean there is some other force directing this
meaningful coincidence.
Right.
Something is going on. There is some sort of, the countless people who've had a spiritual experience will report back.
No.
There's something going on behind the veil.
More than you can't. I mean, a meaningful experience, a meaningful coincidence. In fact, I'm arguing that's what it is. A meaningful coincidence. Yeah. What it seems like you're arguing by synchronicity is that there is some other power at work here. Right. There is either, whether
not totally. I would say, yes and no. It's a divine dichotomy. You and I are separate. That is true. We can both make an argument from that. There's another perspective that says you and I are one. So it's relative truths. It's relative perspectives. What vantage point are we speaking from? So from one perspective, I would say it's all me, and it's me reflecting me back to me. So it's I am it, and it is me. The drop of water is, the ocean is contained in the drop, right? Rumi said. So I am the one doing it all. I'm God-godding. I'm source having my own private experience in my own YO universe. And as I get more, as the blinders expand more and more, I start to see more and more of the patterns and the connectivity, and it starts reflecting back in more dramatic fashion once I've opened myself to the potential that this is indeed a possibility of how things are structured. And that's really what I would say.
I didn't entirely understand that, because I guess what I'm, a meaningful coincidence to me means that all these elements came together in one place, and because we are meaning making, we have evolved to recognize patterns of meaning and to often overlay meaning on top of things that are not necessarily connected. That this coincidence, this grouping of things has meaning for us. I can easily accept that. What I don't believe, and I think there's no evidence, no matter how unlikely,
how many of them happen.
Yeah, well, not only how many, but also how unlikely. Like you're taking one event, saying it's so unlikely that this would happen by random chance, that this is synchronous, meaning there's some force that's brought these things together to create meaning and send a message to me. To me, that has to imply there's some other force that's
brought it together. No,
right.
I call it me. I know. No other force. Yeah. It's me. I did it because I am everything. So, that's sort of splitting hairs about, I don't need to assign power outside of myself. I think I am the power. And I think you are too. I think you are source having an experience, and you have amnesia, just like when you go to sleep at night and you think the bear's chasing you through the woods, and then you wake up and you're like, I forgot I'm Alex laying here in bed, and I really believed I was in the woods somewhere getting chased. That's what I believe is happening to you. I think you're an eternal being that has amnesia to who and what you were before you came here.
I understand. So, well, that would explain, and so if that hypothesis is true, then the notion of synchronicity makes total sense. But that's also why I don't believe in it, because I don't subscribe to that view. And not that I think that view is impossible. There's no evidence that I've had, and no evidence that I've ever seen that makes me think that's the case. And there's an alternative explanation that seems much more likely to me. So I'm, like I said, I'm open to that, but I have to have more than just people noticing patterns, because I'm so well aware of how people overinterpret and misinterpret patterns all the time.
Sure. Well, here's what I would like to do, a fun little experiment with you. And because I do believe, I am tapping into the ultimate truth in regards to what's happening behind the scenes, so to speak. I believe that if you are indeed open, we can co-create synchronicity just by giving energy to it in this moment. So I would like to say, first off, are you open to the possibility that you could experience something that would shake your core belief that this is all sort of just coincidence and
Yes.
nothing more? Okay.
Yes, but what I would require to believe might be quite a bit stricter than what you would accept. And I also have to say, I apologize. I am running out of time. So
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll wrap up here. So what I would say is, if you're open to it, just by giving the energy to the idea that there is something beyond us, or an extension of you that would like for you to sort of expand your perspective, that I believe that you are going to have an experience that is like, wow, that was intense. And Brandon kind of predicted this was going to happen. And maybe you chalk it up to, just more coincidence, or maybe it's so ground shaking that it actually gets you to reconsider your perspective. Okay. And so I would like to invite that energy in at this exact moment. And if you should have something that is really powerful, tying in this whole conversation and the idea that there's more going on with synchronicity. Perhaps someone brings this topic up to you in really dramatic, kind of odd, weird fashion at the coffee shop or whatever, that you report back to me and say, okay, Brandon, I'm not saying you have to come back and say you're right and I'm convinced, but I would just ask that you report back to me and let me know if we were able to co-create some sort of experience happening for you. Fair enough?
I will.
All right. I will. This is fun. I hope you take everything. I get passionate, obviously, about this topic, and I hope you take it with no disrespect. I totally respect and honor your perspective, and you're obviously a very sharp, wise individual, and a lot of the information that you share, all the information you shared here, was really important and powerful, and I greatly, greatly appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and talk about it. It's been a great conversation for me as well.
Cool. Well, I do have one final question to leave you with, and it is this. In 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life, according to Alex Lickerman?
Oh, the meaning of life. So I actually take issue with the question. I'm gonna ask it in a different way, and then I'll answer it. So the meaning of life implies that, and maybe you didn't mean this way, but I think I think the meaning of life is that we are meaning-seeking creatures, and that we crave meaning and we create meaning, but I do not think that there is meaning externally granted to us or created for us to answer that question. Meaning, there isn't an ultimate purpose outside of ourselves, that we all crave meaning and need to feel our lives are meaningful, and that we must in some way find a way to do that. But I think I would say that the goal of life, in fact, what we all have evolved to desire more than anything else, is to be happy. And there's obviously an entire, more than one, a book written about that I wrote that explains why I think, how one does that and why that's important. But I think in broadest terms, I'd say the meaning of life is to be happy. Excellent.
Well, I fully receive all of your insight and wisdom, Alex. And maybe you can, as we sort of sign off here, share with people the best way for them to follow you and where they can find your books and all of that.
Yeah, so my books, they're bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, of course. You can find them there. I have a website, alexlickerman, all one word, .com. We have a website also for the second book, the 10 Worlds, all one word, .com as well. There's actually even, I should point out, on that website, there's a quiz or a survey that if you're interested, you can take it. It will tell you what your basic life tendency is according to the schema of the 10 worlds, which of the worlds of the 10 of them you tend to fall into. People find that very interesting. We're learning, once people have taken that and then actually buy the book and read about it, the feedback we've gotten is that the quiz is quite accurate. So if you're interested in learning about what might be the core belief you hold about what happiness is and where you spend most of your time, you might find that interesting to try.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex, for showing up. You are an inspiration, my friend. Until next time, journey well.
Brandon, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise. Well, everyone, that concludes this week's interview episode. Before we sign off, I wanted to let you all know that we have finally created the game with the universe on our website, where you can choose the first number that comes to your mind and it'll pull up that episode number of the podcast. I've been saying this is a great way to co-create synchronicity and magic with your higher self for quite some time by doing this manually. But now if you go to positivehead.com/YO universe, there is a super fun and simple interface to play this game with your higher self. I firmly believe just by setting the intention to play in this way, it opens up the door for magic, and it's a synchronistic way to hone in on nuggets of wisdom out of the huge catalog of episodes that are specifically appropriate for you at this time in your journey to becoming the next greatest and grandest version of yourself. And it also makes for a super fun way to engage and invite friends, family, people on social media to check out the podcast as well. So be sure to check out positivehead.com/YOUNIVERSE and be sure to tell all your friends so they can play a game with the universe, which also helps the show to reach new people, which I greatly appreciate. And as a quick reminder, be sure to also check out positivehead.com/transformation if you're curious to learn more about Purium superfoods and why I take them every day. On this journey of becoming the next greatest and grandest version of ourselves that we have all embarked upon, I can't stress the importance of managing your physical vibration enough. And quite honestly, Purium has put together the simplest plan I've found to do so, and I'm sincerely excited to share it with all of you. Otherwise, as you continue on your fabulous journey in this 3D reality, be sure to remember this. As long as you ain't dead, you're already positive ahead. Journey well, everyone, and thank you for being.